Hi, I'm Anjali Alapat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 3, I'm going to be talking to some wonderful South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. This week, we have our first returning guest. We're thrilled to welcome back Vajra Chandrasekera, whose debut novel, The Saint of Bright Doors, has been such an enormous success. The book has been nominated for 10 awards so far, and we're pretty sure there are more to come. In this episode, we discuss his recently released second book, Rakesfall, a fascinating cross-genre novel which follows two characters across space, time, and life cycles and explores themes of power, resistance, and connections. We also touch upon repackaged Buddhism, gallows humor, how colonialism has flattened the world, our love for occult stuff, South Asian writers, and books we can get our teeth into. Hi, Vajra. Welcome back to Arcx. Thank you so much for joining us today. Also, congratulations on another award nomination, which is, I believe, the British Fantasy Awards. And of course, on Rakesfall, which is one of the most funny, bewildering, and beautiful books I've encountered this year. I'm just really excited to have you back. How have you been?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on again. And thank you so much for the kind words. It was, in fact, the British Fantasy Award that just happened last week.
At this point, I think it's easier to count the ones that you haven't been nominated for, which is, I'm sure you're too modest to say it, but I'm going to say it, is amazing to see. So again, congratulations for all of it.
Thank you. It's been, I think, 10 nominations. I am keeping account for pure bragging rights,
As you should.
Someone has to.
So I'm very excited to talk about this book, which is very, very different to The Saint of Bright Doors. I don't know what I was expecting, but you do have a gift because the minute I started reading, I couldn't put it down. I was up till 2 a.m., kind of hating myself for having to be an adult the next day. And also, kind of, as I said, bewildered. I was like, what the hell is happening? I mean, I'm really into it, but I am very confused. And I must say that while Saint is one of the best debut novels I've ever read, Rakesfall does feel very different, but at the same time, more confident and unapologetic in the best possible way. So, how did the process compare? I mean, writing Saint and writing Rakesfall.
Perhaps oddly, I wrote the bulk of them in the same year. I wrote Saint in the first half of 2020, and I was making notes on Rakesfall for much of that time, especially towards the end. And I started writing Rakesfall in, I think, like September of that year. It was 2021 when I finished. It was like halfway into the next year, but the bulk of it was written in the same year. I hadn't sold either one at this point. I intended Saint to be the first one because I figured that Rakesfall would be a harder sell both to a publisher and to readers as a debut, right? Because I think, like, to a large extent, Rakesfall requires a certain degree of trust, right? The reader has to trust you a little bit to know that you're doing something on purpose. What I was hoping for was that Saint would build the trust that I could then exploit with Rakesfall. It's a very different kind of book, but at the same time, it's also, I think, the book that I was wanting to write for longer. Because parts of Rakesfall actually go back to before I even tried writing Saint, like some of the sections which are published as standalone short stories.
That's what I realized when I read the acknowledgements part of it. I was wondering how long it had been on your mind because clearly it had been taking shape over the years. And was it a relief to kind of have it out?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some of the older stories, like Heron of Earth, which was in Clarkesworld, I don't even remember when, I think it was 2016. So at that time, I knew that story was part of a book. I had this little chunk of it which I thought worked as a short story, so I sent it out and it sold. And I had some idea of this kind of like far future post-human world. I knew that was part of like a longer epic, but I did not have a good grasp of what that book could be. A lot of those early pieces were the parts that I felt worked as standalones in a book that I did not yet have a grasp on. So it took me until after the Saint of Pride Tours to actually figure it out as a book. Because I think teaching yourself to write a book full stop is one thing, but then teaching yourself to write a book like Rakesfall is another thing. You kind of have to do those things in order.
I can understand that and I can appreciate that because it is a very different book to anything I've read before. And I mean, before we go any further, I'm going to ask a very terrible question. But for readers who might not have read Rakesfall yet, could you summarize it? And I know it's an awful question because I'm not sure how to summarize it and I just read it.
It is a difficult book to summarize. I'm relying heavily on like other people who have summarized this very much more ably than I have. So I've just kind of like memorized little bit from reviews. I'm like, oh yeah, that's good. I'm stealing that. So I would say Rexfall is a cross-genre story following two people from world to world as they recur or reincarnate across history, across different pasts, futures, and realities, from the mythic past to modern Sri Lanka to a far future Earth. The relationship between these two people changes as they change. Sometimes they're the same person. They always seem to betray each other, and one of them always dies. But they keep finding each other again and again. And it's a story about how they have to keep doing this until they learn to fight on the same side. So Rick's Fall is about power and about how power, no matter how totalizing it might be, is always accompanied by resistance. How every throne is vulnerable to rebellion.
And I see that as a real theme in your work, which I love. And I'm excited to see how you expand on that in future books. I mean, before we get into all that, I want to say that I really love the language you use in this book. It is poetic in spurts, and at other times I was just laughing my head off, especially when there are phrases like best bro. And then there are whole stories that can be told in just capitalization of words. So I do feel like you've embraced the weirdness in this one. I mean, was that freeing? Do you think that also kind of helped make it more relatable in a way?
Yeah, I think so. And it's part of the whole the reincarnation device is that it's not just the characters that change or the setting, right? It's also the narrative format. So the style and register of storytelling changes because moving through world to world is another way of saying moving through different stories. And different stories are told in different ways and different voices. So that is very freeing in I think a lot of ways because especially with a story with a large scope, it can I think be tiresome to have the whole thing told in a single style or register. I don't know if this like necessarily comes across to all readers. I like to think of myself as writing, you know, light-hearted, funny stories, at least some of the time.
I mean, I don't know about lighthearted, but they're definitely fun. So I'll give you that.
I mean, lighthearted is also like I guess like gallows humor is so ingrained in Sri Lankan, in South Asian culture as well that I feel like a lot of gallows humor is very lighthearted. We take a lot of very dark things very lightly because, well, what can you do?
Yeah, that's a question for the ages. What can you do? Anyway.
That's kind of what the book is about.
Right? Yes, we are so on topic. Anyway, I also wanted to ask about the kind of nitty gritty of creating this novel because Saint was set in a singular world, but this book has, we do have prolonged glimpses into several different ones across time and space. And there's glimpses of worlds where, the dead walk, post-apocalyptic world where the characters are on a show watched by others, which, by the way, very unnerving reality TV nod, especially because you suspect the others who are watching are dead. I mean, there's a whole thing, and none of it is linear. So was that hard to put together? How did you keep it all straight in your head?
I think I kept it straight by writing it very linearly. The book itself, well, it's relatively non-linear. I wouldn't say it's completely non-linear because overall, apart from like a couple of sort of loops that are effectively flashbacks, it more or less goes from the past to the future overall, broadly, with some like flashbacks to the deeper past. But yeah, it's very stylistically non-linear, so I think like that it makes it feel more not less linear than it actually is. I wrote all of that in sequence. So I was following the thread of the story. And to me, there's a very direct kind of like thread, narrative thread, even though there's all this variation of style, of setting, of character, very much following the like a singular thread throughout this whole book. even the parts where it gets a little twisty and time loopy, because there is a straightforward character arc if you read it that way, between where the characters begin and how they end, and the particular sort of conflicts that they spend all these lifetimes trying to overcome.
And speaking of these two main characters, if you can call them that, they move around a lot in both a physical and metaphysical sense. And the relationship between them is very complex and it's very reflective of the lives that they've lived. So, could you tell us a bit about creating them and why these two? I mean, I just want to know more about the thought process of creating these kind of elements. I wouldn't even call them characters because they change so much.
I think while they do change, there are some consistencies of personality, I think, across the whole book. And that's partly because the personality is how you can identify them, because really everything else about them changes. Well, I mean, there are some mirrorings in the names, for example, but there is a sense, for example, that Leverett is the joiner, right? Annalyn is the loner. Annalyn is more suspicious. Being a loner works for her, but also gets her into trouble. And it's the same way with Leverett. Sometimes he joins up with good causes, and sometimes he joins up with very bad causes. And their conflicts are driven in many ways by his constant attempt to recruit her into something and her refusal to do it. So, in that sense, there are, I think, like broad parallels across all these different settings. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they are like archetypes or anything quite so abstract. To me, they are very much characters in the sense of like a particular kind of imagination of each of them. But in that sense, they're also difficult to describe in the same way that a person is difficult to describe. People are very contradictory, and people are contradictory. And I think this is true of like a character. An interesting character is contradictory in the same way. Like it's not a contradiction that is paradoxical or difficult to understand. Right? The contradictions in people in an interesting character. It's like how a person's strength is also their weakness. Their greatest strength is also, in a way, their biggest weakness. So if you're independent, for example, you're also likely going to be lonely. That is a contradiction, but it's a kind of contradiction that's inbuilt into a trait. So I think that's the kind of thing that I was trying to like use as an anchor for these characters, that they are bundles of these kinds of traits which are recognizable even under different names in different worlds and different, and each of these contradictions represents, I think, a kind of struggle over the long term. So in a way, like the whole thing could be read as a psychological drama for these characters as they work out their own internal struggles across history, which is in a way what we are all doing. This is what life is, right? We traverse different worlds as we grow older and inhabit very different, like the world of the adult is very different from the world of the child. The world of being at home is very different from being at work, and so forth. We constantly like shift genre, shift register. We are constantly like inhabiting different worlds and bringing forth different aspects of our personalities, our personas, some which feel truer than others, some which are false, but also very much part of ourselves in the sense of that the protective self that we build around ourselves to survive, for example, the workplace. So to me, it's a book that's very normal in the sense that it's about life, but written in a way that's larger than life, which I think is the kind of the great power of fantasy in general, or speculative fiction in general, is that it can make life, it can explode it like it's under a magnifying glass and like show very ordinary things look very bizarre when you look at them zoomed in, right? Things that look like a flat surface under a microscope, you can see all the little mountains and valleys that go up into making the flattest of flat surfaces. And I think that's what fantasy is like in a way. Like you get to show what ordinary life is like under a kind of microscope or under a kind of very bright light that highlights all the extremes that have been there all along.
Absolutely. And I think that's a lovely way of describing it because it's a huge range of things that you're exploring in this book. But at the same time, I felt it was, in a strange way, more grounded in quote unquote reality than Saint. And I mean, it does showcase a lot of Sri Lanka, which very directly, in a way that you haven't done before. And I was very curious about that. How do you feel about it now? And how have people who've read it reacted to it?
Well, most Sri Lankans have not read it yet, right? Because the book only came out a couple of months ago, and the paperback only comes out next year. So it's going to be a while before it's even available in Sri Lanka. So far, the people who have read it have taken the Sri Lankan sections in stride. I enjoyed writing those sections because really it seemed like it would be a waste to write a story that traveled multiple universes and did not include like our world very directly among them. And it allows me to, I think, comment on a bunch of things about Sri Lanka in a way that is very almost refreshingly literal for me because the set of bright doors kept everything at a kind of allegorical remove. That was also freeing in a way because it meant that people didn't need to know anything about Sri Lanka to read the book. I think I wanted to highlight that insofar as moving between worlds means moving between stories, between narratives, moving through our own world is also moving through a narrative because we have a story of what our world is, what Sri Lanka is, what its modern day history is, and that's the same for any place. We are writing the history of our time as we live it. And in our heads, right, there is a narrative that will one day like some version of that ends up in the newspapers, some version of that ends up in the history books, and that is the story that will be told of our time. So it's also like about narrative and very much about the stories that we tell and which parts of it are allowed to be told and which parts of it will be remembered. So for me, the pleasure of moving through the Sri Lanka chapters was telling like a very kind of slanted version of a real time and place that and events that did not actually happen but could have.
While reading this book, I was thinking, I didn't think you could critique colonialism, capitalism, and religion any more harshly than you did in Saint. And then you dropped this bomb. And it's a very scathing book. I mean, it's hilariously funny, but very scathing. And while this is largely based on Buddhism, with some nods to Hinduism, I think, there's a sense of universality to your critique of where religion meets state and majoritarian religious movements. And I mean, why was that so important to make central to the story? Because I did feel like it was one of the major themes.
I mean, it's obviously been one of the biggest parts of my life growing up during the war and then with the genocide in 2009. I feel like the collision of religion and state has done almost like unfathomable damage to people and to Sri Lanka and to everywhere else. I mean, this is what's happening in Palestine right now. It's such a big part of American politics, everybody's politics, right? What's happening in India. I think colonialism and imperialism represent a certain combination of repeating set of patterns of history, like these certain kinds of systems of power, of violence, of oppression. Modern day so-called quote-unquote post-colonial. When I say post-colonial, I don't just mean the countries that were once colonies. I mean also the colonizers, right? Because it's the same applies to us all, right? Like what they did to us, they did to themselves. So we are like all in the same boat now. The world is post-colonial, and the world that is post-colonial also has these repeating patterns of how the modern late capitalist state functions, how police brutality works, how preventive detention, mass incarceration works, how justice systems work, how censorship work, how states use religion for censorship and imprisonment and oppression of minorities, minority religions, how pogroms and genocide work. They happen in Sri Lanka, they happen in Palestine, and they happen everywhere. They happen in India, in America. This is not like a particularly new insight. So, as bell hooks called it, the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, and also, or possibly the white supremacist heteropatriarchal capitalist culture, but an attempt to kind of gesture at basically at our world and to say, okay, these are the parts of it that you need to be paying attention to if you want to understand why anything is the way it is. It's too big to be constitute like a criticism in itself because it's rather like a gesture at like many different fields of study and criticism because it takes like so much effort just to track everything that is going on. But at the same time, you can say that capitalism has and imperialist and colonialist history has flattened the world, just like the globalization era neoliberals claimed for it. The world has been flattened, but flattened in this very particular way, which is to say that we all have this exact same fascist police state breathing down our necks. And it all operates the same way according to the same playbook. There's a reason why the genocide in Palestine follows the same pattern, the same playbook as the Sri Lankan genocide in 2009, because this playbook emerges from the same complex of systems of oppressive governance, of apartheid, of religious and language and racial supremacy that our cultures have been built upon. And the reason our cultures are built upon that is because of this history of colonialism and imperialism going back to the British Empire and before that. So there are grand patterns in history and forces with a great deal of inertia, which I think, like a lot of cultures that are very deeply enmeshed in these systems, refuse to look at directly. Right? We all grow up in cultures that will not face any of this directly and will not say, okay, so what we think of as our unique and special culture is actually just one expression of a bunch of imperial dynamics that weren't even ours in any meaningful sense, but are now ours in the sense that they represent forms of violence that we are enacting, that the governments that we elect are enacting. And I think like that's important to point out, even though like some people will find it all very obvious, and other people will find it very offensive and insulting to their, treasured like cultures which they believe to be ancient and authentic or whatever. You can probably hear the tiredness in my voice when I say this.
I can also hear the air quotes because I use them personally. First off, I want to really say that I appreciate how you talk about this because I do think that there is a tendency by a lot of people to kind of romanticize war and oppression in a way. And they don't really want to take a good hard look at what the systems behind it actually are. It's very easy to write about it from the point of view of like, oh, it's in a fantasy book and I've distanced myself from it. But it's very kind of hard to reckon with perhaps your complicity in it. Maybe not you as a person, but you as part of a system. And I mean, a lot of what you've described in the Sri Lankan context sounds very ugly and familiar and is a mirror that we don't really like holding up, but I can see its reflection in a lot of South Asia and the world, really. And you mentioned Palestine, and I do really appreciate that you consistently speak up about the genocide because I do think a lot of people are kind of quietly hoping it goes away.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I've always thought of fantasy as something that, as the opposite of escapism. I think escapism is a technique. I'm not saying I'm not against escapism in any kind of fiction, but I don't think escapism is inherent to fantasy as a form, right? I think it's the other way around. Really. I think escapism can be something that you can put into any kind of literature, including like, very contemporary realist. It's very common in like sort of the bourgeois novel of manners that is like in its modern form, where you basically just like obsessed with like relationship drama and ignoring where the money comes from, who dies to maintain this comfortable bubble. The bubble effect is very much part of this thing that I'm trying to kind of gesture at here. For example, like I've seen people read my books and say, oh, this is about authoritarian states. Authoritarian states are bad. Authoritarian states over there. The authoritarian states are things that happen in Sri Lanka. Oh, it's so bad in Sri Lanka. And I'm like, yes, Sri Lanka is going through some stuff, but I write about Sri Lanka because I'm from Sri Lanka. And that's what I know best. That's what I care the most about. That is my language for speaking about authoritarian governments and political violence is Sri Lankan because I'm Sri Lankan. But political violence is the same everywhere, right? Like it's not like America is like doesn't have an authoritarian state, as like literally any catalog of police brutality and mass incarceration would tell you, right? It's just that there is this very successful narrative of freedom of and democracy and so forth, which a fantasy, as if you will. And that one is an escapist fantasy, right? This is the difference between the escapist fantasy and the fantasy that is about shining a light into dark places. And I think that escapism is the kind of escapism that people indulge in when they hope that like things will go away if you don't have to deal with it. If you just can ignore the genocide for another month or two, maybe it will be over. Or like if you just don't talk about Neil Gaiman being a sex pest, maybe it will blow over. Which I think a lot of people are still trying that one, even though like the story is getting bigger and he's apparently hired some PR firm to go around spamming the internet about like his TV shows or whatever, which is precisely what every celebrity sex pest does because they can afford those PR firms. There's a lot of I'm just an entertainer, don't look at me, and hopefully like nobody will shout at me. Which yeah, I think like political maturity or emotional maturity comes from begins at the point where will someone shout at me or not stops being your biggest problem.
So, I mean, yes to the Neil Gaiman sex pest thing. It's driving me wild. I think I've gone through the various stages of denial, grief, and anger now, and I'm firmly lodged in anger. But that's where I have been firmly lodged, I think, since everything started last year with Palestine. So, not shocking. I mean, coming back to the book, though I really hate to take us away from this really not at all depressing conversation, I really wanted to touch on the kind of philosophical things that you discussed in your book. I mean, for example, the Akashic record, which a concept sounds very familiar to me as someone who's grown up in India and has kind of rubbed shoulders with Hinduism and Buddhism. But I assume a lot of your readers have only a very kind of basic understanding of the complexity of these ideas. Because, I think people have a very kind of rosy picture of what reincarnation or collective memory or even the concept of eternal suffering and the cycle of existence are. And a friend of mine was reading your book, and she has some passing knowledge of these concepts, but she was like, God, this is really brutal. And I'm like, it's always been brutal. It's never been fun, And but you've used these concepts very liberally in the book, which I absolutely adore. But I wanted to hear more about why these concepts and why you delved into this.
Ironically, I think the Akashic codes are like the whole concept is really at this point more of a Western thing than an Eastern thing because like it was a favorite shtick of a lot of Western occultists, right? Like 100 years ago or so, Crowley and whatnot. A lot of those magical occultist type people. And I love that shit. That it's all like bonkers, and a lot of it is so directly linked to our culture, like because they got that shit from us, and then we got it back from them in the modern day kind of thing. That means that for one thing, none of it is quote unquote authentic, right? It's all like irretrievably like distorted. And I enjoy that. I like the inauthenticity of it, like how like none of it makes any sense whatsoever. But the reason it's so appealing is also because these big ideas have the same kind of appeal that big kind of fantasy or science fictional ideas do, right? Which is why there's so much overlap between occultism and speculative fiction as a genre. In fact, there was a period when like perfectly respectable science fiction constantly had like telepathy and whatnot, like ESP powers were like a standard part of science fiction, not fantasy. So this is my nod to that as well. But it's also kind of like a very useful device for me. It's a way to kind of talk about reincarnation the way I want to talk about it. The very prosaic idea that everything is naturally, of course, reincarnated in the sense of, the conservation of mass and energy. We are, in fact, quite literally the stuff of the past. And that is both like this tremendously profound like insight and also this utterly banal truism because it's not new to any of us, right? Like it's been in the culture for both for decades and for centuries, if not millennia. So the other reason that I wanted to draw on these kinds of very South Asian tropes and kind of ideas is because partly because I've seen these devices used by Western writers in very literal ways. Like South Asian culture in Western fantasy by Western writers has, broadly speaking, not had a good time of it. A lot of it has just been straight up racist. For example, Song of Kali by Dan Simmons, which is this super racist book full of stereotypes of Kolkata and Kali for that matter, and won like a World Fantasy Award back in the 80s. So it was like this for a long time that was kind of the pinnacle of speculative fiction about South Asia, written by some white guy who was literally doing the most basic kind of like stereotypical racism as fantasy. or like in less racist ways, there's, for example, Kim Stanley Robinson's Years of Rice and Salt. That's a good book. I liked it. It was a Western fantasy novel that used the device of reincarnation in a reasonable way, in what I thought was a very literal and very mechanistic way. It's in a way that is also very typical of both the West and even South Asia, because we get a lot of our religion and our culture from the West now, right? From the British Empire, because the British imperial interpretations of South Asian culture were what was force fed back to us in schools and in history books and in books of anthropology or whatever. So, for example, modern day Buddhism is extremely Western, which is, I think, a big part of the problem is why it's so racist and so, because it was kind of built that way in response to both by the West and by quote unquote anti colonial agitators who were themselves trained to think in terms of racialization and demographic superiority. These are like hazards of taking these bits of like South Asian culture, these ideas like reincarnation, is that you have so many different versions of them that you can draw on. And most of those versions are very like blatantly distorted in bad ways or in useless ways. It's not really about becoming a better person. It's more about like gaining points and leveling up, right? It's not about like nirvana. It's about the very opposite of that, which is about being reborn into a better life than the one you have now through doing like quote unquote good works, which are very, very broadly defined in the modern era. For example, like making donations to wealthy temples and corrupt monks is a good deed, apparently. So
Oh, yes, it sounds very familiar.
yeah, so this is the kind of thing that I wanted to critique in the literary sense of like bringing in a different set of these ideas, a different reading of all of these ideas into fantasy, into literature, but also critiquing the version of it that exists in the modern day in our cultures. This is, we all think we know what reincarnation means, but what if it meant something completely different?
It is a very interesting observation that in our own ways we become quite westernized in our pursuit of religion.
Yeah, and the ironic thing is that the most westernized religious people in South Asia are the so quote unquote conservatives, right? Because they're the ones who are most purely British, most purely colonial in their like outlook.
Oh, they're going to love this.
Yeah.
Something else that I've really enjoyed about your work is that the myths you draw from, the folk tales, the epics, they're all very South Asian. And you don't really feel the need to make them palatable to the Western gaze, which is something I really appreciate. And you're not over explaining them or toning them down. So, in some way, I feel like you kind of drop people in these worlds. They're supposed to kind of figure it out as they go along. And I've seen some mixed reviews of this, but I mean, the majority, I think, of genre fiction reviewers and readers at this point are part of the Western dominant culture, I would say. How do you feel like that has changed the reception of both Saint and Rakesfall?
I think at more than one level, my whole project is about trusting the reader. I have a great deal of trust in the reader, clearly, because I am throwing a lot of stuff, at this person and trusting that they will follow. And I know that a lot of people will not follow, and that is fine. There is such a thing as a book just not being for someone, and I'm not expecting these to have the broadest possible appeal, shall we say, because I think like the broadest possible appeal comes from books that don't get too deep into anything. But a lot of very complicated books have found their audiences, and sometimes very large audiences, precisely by getting very deep into something. You don't have the broadest possible appeal, but you can have pretty broad appeal by, I think, finding the right readers. And I do think the right readers are out there because there are readers who actively enjoy things that they can get their teeth into. I've always been one of those readers myself. I think those are my favorite books. So I think I wanted to write books for readers like myself who are always on the hunt for something that will feel nourishing at more than one level. And which is not to say that I don't enjoy like things that are purely kind of just like, you know, fluffy. I do. But if I don't have like a bunch of meaty books in my diet, I feel, well, undernourished is a good way to put it. And I feel like there are a lot of readers like this because publishing also gets very over dependent on broadest possible appeal and kind of ignoring a whole bunch of books that are not tougher to get into. There are so many like really great books that deserve like a bigger push. Writers like Sophia Samata, for example, should be, in my opinion, should be as big as Sarah J. Maas and Live in Hope. But so many writers like this, I think, like take time to build up their readership of people whose very particular itches are being scratched by these very peculiar books, right? And I think I do have hope for this kind of writing as a whole, because I feel like there is a whole kind of culture or tradition of books like this in speculative fiction itself, going back like to Mervyn Peake or M. John Harrison. And I think like South Asia in particular is like getting very good at producing writers in this style, like Kolila Manikavel or Indrapramit Das or Prashant Mehta. And I think that is a good sign. It's partly because South Asian market is relatively small. So, like right now, it's rewarding people who are just doing whatever they want to do in a way, because also that the kind of writers who will keep writing even if there is no market.
I mean, that's a good way to look at it. I was going to ask if you felt that things had opened up more after Saint, in the sense that I suddenly feel like there are more people being offered international opportunities. There were, of course, a robust population of writers who were writing in India and in Sri Lanka and didn't really make the transition into the West. And I do feel now that there is a sudden pickup in writers who are getting published abroad. Have you seen that kind of trend also?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I always, to the opening up of online magazines and the late 2000s through the early 20 teens, I think that nurtured like a generation of writers from South Asia as well as elsewhere into publishing. And at the same time, it also, the trend towards electronic submissions also opened up to publishers and agents, and the whole ecosystem kind of opened up and went online in that era. So I think you have a generation of like writers who cut their teeth on short fiction like 10 years ago. And like Amal Sen, for example, was publishing short fiction around the same time as me. And now he has a book out as well from Flame Tree Press, right? The Garden of Delights. And then you have like writers like who have been publishing even longer, like Samit Basu, who I think published like both in India and in the West earlier, but didn't really take off like in the West the first time he tried it. But now I think like getting more of a better deal now with like City Inside and Jinbot, because Jinbot was up for a Goodreads Choice Awards. This is really good. This is a much bigger audience now. And Prashant Srivasta's like book just came out, and I think is like a Sunday Times bestseller. Congrats, Prashant, if you're listening.
He better be.
Yeah, so I think like and the writers have been there the whole time. In other words, I think what Summit proves is like what the writers have been there the whole time, but the industry has changed, and that is a good thing. Like Tashan's book actually came out in India, but Manchester University, but then she got the US deal shortly afterwards, which I think would have been much harder 10 years ago when Liar's Wave came out. Right, I think the industry was not in that place at the time. But clearly, there has been like an opening up, and not just for South Asia, but for other parts of the world that were similarly overlooked. Like, I think there are a lot more African writers and lots of writers from different parts of Asia as well, who are kind of like getting those book deals, getting those translation deals, or whatever. I'm very hopeful that this continues. It is tricky in a sense because, in a way, it introduces a whole new stack of problems for the writer, because now you have like a new readership who are not necessarily going to be as familiar with your work as maybe your South Asian readers were, and who are not necessarily going to react to it in the same way. And now you have to like juggle a whole new set of problems, like how much do I have to translate myself, how much do I have to explain, will people trust me enough to follow along with this? But these are good problems to have.
They are. One last thing about Rakesfall is when I tried to condense the themes of the book, which is not an easy feat, I think you will admit, it is really about, and I see that in common with Saint as well, is about systems of power and oppression and connections really at the heart of it. And I mean, were those the themes that you kind of wanted to stand out the most, or were you kind of going for somewhere else and being hampered by my flawed reading?
No, no, you're reading it very accurately. I think I wanted that to come across as clearly and like directly as possible, to the point to pretty much say it explicitly, like on the page multiple times. I think Zach Gillum, his Interzone review, like picked this out as well. It just came out like the other day. It's a hard book to describe, but the theme is very clear, which is punish the guilty and eat the rich.
I did read that and I laughed out loud and I was like, yes, that is absolutely it. Are these themes that you kind of want to build on in your future work, or are there things that you feel like you haven't gotten a chance to tackle yet? Because I'm assuming you're writing more stuff.
Yeah, I'm working on a third book as we speak. I think these are themes that will always be present in my work. They have been in my short fiction pretty much the whole time. There will be other themes as well, but I think these are kind of like the meat and bones of it. There are themes and obsessions that you will move through. You will do them and they're done. There will be experimental periods and explorations and so forth. But there are also themes that stay with you for the duration of your career. And I think this one is one of those for me.
I'm very glad to hear that because you're doing it well. And also, one thing, you've actually taken us back to Fetter's world in Rakesfall, the world where the Saint of Bright Nose is set. And I think the last time we spoke, you had hinted at this. And do you think you're going to do it again? Because I kind of want to know what happens with Fetter. And also, I love any and all references to Perfect and Kind because he is the cultiest of cult leaders. And I feel like we kind of need to give him his due.
I don't have any direct plans to revisit that story. I do like the idea of like keeping of having Laureate as a space I can revisit. I don't want to close off anything for myself. Maybe I will pick up the story at some point in the future, but I don't have any direct sequel plans. I don't want to write kinds of stories. There's a phrase in the business when you're querying novels and whatnot, you're supposed to write standalones with series potential. Have you heard that one?
Yes, I have. It gives you a particular kind of chill down your spine. Yes.
Yeah, standalone with serious potential is one of the things that at one point writers were being told to put in our query letters when we were trying to talk to agents or editors. Because the reason it's standalone with serious potential is because they probably don't want to commit money to a series. This is, I feel like, unfair to the writer on like both fronts. It's not letting you just write the standalone, and it's not letting you commit to a series either. Because in case the first one doesn't sell, they want to be able to say, oh no, that was just a standalone. So I wanted to avoid this whole problem and just write standalones because much as I love reading series, I do not think I am going to write them. So I feel like returning to Feta himself would make it too series like for my taste. The Laureate bit that happens in Rakesfall is some time after an indeterminate amount of time, like a few years after the events of the Saint of Bright Rose.
I mean, I'm kind of sad about it, but at the same time, I think I'm glad you're not doing a Harper Lee. I don't need you to go back and recast Fetter as the prime villain. But coming back to the third book, can you tell us a bit about what you're working on and what can we expect next?
Ah, well, this one's tricky because it's very, very inchoate. I actually have like multiple third book projects going on, so I've been trying to juggle between them. But the one I'm working on now, I've just started, so I don't really have like particularly good grasp on it yet. It will probably be more like the Saint of Pectos than Rick's Fall, in the sense that it will probably be like a single point of view character and not like multiple worlds or whatever. But other than that, it will be different. It will be different in ways that are not like either of the two books that are out so far, because one does hate to repeat oneself. But I don't know exactly what form it will take yet, because I am at that point in the process where I don't even know how it ends yet, and that is very inchoate. There will be a book. It will have words and sentences, probably.
I have a great deal of faith in you. I also do believe that it will be different because, I mean, just going off Saint and Rakesfall, like I said, I didn't know what I expected, but you delivered either way. Anyway, thank you so much for doing this, Vajra. You're our first repeat guest. And I just wanted to say once again how absolutely thrilled I am about the success that you've been having. It's been really wonderful to watch. We're always rooting for you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me on again. I'm very happy to be the first repeat guest. I should put that in my bio.
I mean, forget those award nominations. First repeat guest. That is what we need right now. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did.
You can follow Vajra on X at _Vajra.
Arcx is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.